Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
Glory be to you, Hecate Phosphorus, whose torches blaze in my hands as I do your work. So too do you shepherd me, Enodia, with gracious wisdom, opening to me the deep places of the sky and the hidden realms of the earth. You are the flame in the darkness of the hermit's cave, where all else is dancing shadow. Praxidise, surely you will cast away illusions from my eyes, and shine the light of justice upon those who speak falsely and act maliciously. Their words are as arrows ill-fletched, never flying true. Their stones are cast too feebly to strike. Impotent and confused, our enemies lament in helpless agitation, and say, surely we have fallen upon the blades of our own wickedness. But my ears hear only your song, lady. My eyes are fixed upon your light. My feet dance the path which leads with honor to your door. Where I supplicate myself at your altar, you have lain tender hands upon me. You stand watch over the gateway to my heart, breathing the heat of courage into my soul. Be with me always. Let the light of your glory shine in my heart. Mother of Techne, let me bring victory to your name, splendor to your gifts, beauty to the craft you have given us. Let the art I wield blaze like the first flame. Let my work be a gate which opens to the whole potential of the void. Invincible guardian of all realms, allow the song of your strength to sing out in my limbs as I ascend steep climbs, wandering where you haunt the mountains and forgotten places. Allow the comfort of your light to reside forever in my breast as I plumb inky darkness into the unknown. Let me be made wiser with steady work, taking joy in the tasks you have given me. Let my efforts bring forth promises fulfilled. Let the tears I have shed purchase safety for those who walk this path after. I am thankful for the trials you set before me. I have been tempered by their heat. They have led me to hallowed ground where I now stand stronger before you, a blade in your steady hand. Use me to cut a new path in the world which I will blaze like your torches. Lady, surely I will do you proud, while it is still my privilege to walk in flesh and toil in bone. And when I have again returned to sit with you in the house of magic, I shall ever be ready to serve again when called by those who would do your bidding. Glory be to you, Phosphorus, whose torches blaze in my hands as I do your work. That is Psalm 786, written by me. Hello and welcome to Lux Occult. This is, of course, the podcast where we gleefully taunt the mundane, butcher the Latin and most other languages, and we also discuss a variety of occult, esoteric, and adjacent concepts, exploring the intersections of magic, art, science, technology, philosophy, and so much more through the lens of chaos magic. This is occultism for everyone. I'm your host, Lux Estrada, and if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, that means that this show, and magic for that matter, are for you if you want them. There are a lot of different ways to be more free in the world, and using magic or making space for a spiritual practice in your life can be one of them. As always, I don't speak for anybody but myself. Others can, will, and should disagree with the things that I say or the things that my guests say on this show sometimes. How we ever learn anything if we were all in agreement on all things at all times after all. And like those who attempt to be reasonable should always be willing to do, I often revise my opinions and thoughts about things based on new evidence. Alright, I'm incredibly excited to be sharing today's episode with you all. I was joined by the co-directors of the Consent Academy, Ariana and Ash, to talk about ways that learning about consent can improve relationships with the self and with others, improve magical work, and so much more. Ariana is an ordained monk in the Tantric Shingon lineage of Buddhism, who has a background in linguistics, education, and violence prevention. And Ash has a background in sex education and domestic violence prevention, and is an abortion doula and adjunct faculty member at Antioch University. We get into a lot of really cool topics, including how to think about consent in relationships with non-human entities, ideas about consent and the will and desire, and kind of feeling that out for yourself and what does that mean, the idea of consent culture and egregores as well. And we are also going to get into Consent Academy's 4-part model of consent and much more. We will ask, what should you do when consent goes wrong? And can you violate your own consent? During a break, I will share an update about the Green Mushroom Project and Void House, which is our new experiment in creating a consent-forward magical space for conducting group work both in person and online, investigating the magical and alchemical properties of consent, and providing consent education to magically inclined people. I'm also going to play you a sound magic track. So we've got a lot of really cool stuff to get into today. But before we do, let me do my due diligence and remind you that if you like this show and the other work that I've been getting into, you can support it on Patreon. If you do so, you can take a bibliomancy break with me, and there are no tiers or levels or whatever, so give as you will. A quick note there, I'm going to be doing these readings for people like the month after they sign up for it. So if you sign up for the Patreon, give it about a month so that it actually will collect money, and then I will do the reading for you. There's been some stuff where people have been getting readings and then skipping out without actually contributing anything, so fuck that. Anyway, Buy Me a Coffee is an option for those who wish to show their support with a one-time donation. Your support literally makes this show possible by allowing me to cover the expenses associated with making it, thereby justifying to myself the kind of wild amount of time I spend making it. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be creating this thing, and to have the resources necessary is an integral part of that equation. So many thanks for the people who are making this show happen by giving on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Gratitude. Although I'm a pretty introverted person, I don't use social media very much due to this. I'm not there like checking on stuff every day or anything like that. But that certainly doesn't mean that I don't want to hear from you all or anything. I'm beyond lucky to have such amazing listeners, collaborators, cohorts, co-conspirators, etc. I always welcome people's thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revelations. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or find me on Instagram at luxoccultpod. And accept no substitutes. Apparently there's some shitty cloned accounts of that out there, but it's Lux Occult Pod, and I will never ever reach out to you with weird offers about services or whatever. When I ask you for money, it'll sound like the Patreon thing I did earlier. Okay, so getting into setting the table for today's episode here, there's a lot of what I consider to be pretty harmful examples of not good consent practices, which are portrayed in TV and the movies and elsewhere. I guess this shouldn't really surprise us too much given the abuse scandals and whatnot that we've seen coming out of Hollywood, and thinking about who might be making these entertainment products and everything. But regardless of the reasons, there is a lot of confusion and wrong or harmful messages about boundaries and consent out there. So it's no wonder that people are very confused about it. So if the demographics that the hosting platform I use for this podcast gives me are to be believed, the majority of the show's audience are people who identify as men. When I spoke with Zach Vudd from the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom about the 5 pillars of consent model he created in episode 45, he pointed out that as a man, he feels that having well thought out and well-grounded consent practices can be a way of not just helping to protect the people that you're with from harm, but also helping to protect yourself from being, accused of harm or unintentionally causing harm through miscommunication or some other types of circumstances. One of the things that we touch on today is how learning about consent and practicing consent can become a sort of spell of protection for you and for others. I work with Hecate a lot, and I do a lot of protective magic in my practice under her aegis, so this is one aspect of things that I get really sort of geared up about. This undertaking that we're doing with Void House, offering these tools for having more positive interactions and for understanding yourself and others with more depth and in a more meaningful way through consent practices, is also a sort of spell of protection, one that we are casting on ourselves and on our community. As I mentioned to Lonnie Scott when I spoke with him for the Weird Web radio show in episode 101, we could make the argument that this is an ethical thing that we would like to have just because it's good and thumbs up and fuck yeah, like consent is sexy, consent's hot. We've heard these things before, but I think it's also possible to make the argument that this is also a very pragmatic way of creating situations which can be very functional and productive and generative for the people involved. So I'm so excited to be getting into this and to be sharing this conversation with y'all. I was so excited to have discovered the Consent Academy. I think the work that they're doing is really cool and really important and really exciting. And I'm so stoked to share this very cool conversation with two very impressive and interesting people with you all. All right, as I said, I'll be back during a break to do some updates. And after the interview, we will do listener mail and shoutouts. But now, sit back, relax, and breathe deeply into your butthole. I promise that will make sense later as we go to my chat with Ash and Ariana from the Consent Academy. All right, well, my guests today are Ash and Ariana from the Consent Academy. Welcome.
Thanks for having us. I'm very excited to be here. This is Ariana.
And I'm Ash. Also very excited to be here. Thank you.
I'm so excited to be talking with you all. I really appreciate the work that you've been doing. I was lucky enough to have attended the consent and leadership courses this summer, and I found it immensely helpful and really inspiring, and it's really added a lot to my life and the community that I help to organize. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe we could start out with kind of giving the listeners a little bit of context about yourselves and about the Consent Academy.
Sure, I can start. I'll talk a little bit about who I am. So this is Ariana. I am along with Ash, co-directors of the Consent Academy. I have a background in psychology, but a master's in linguistics and education. And I really focused in psychology and also in linguistics on things like group violence prevention. And I'm also an ordained Buddhist monk in the Japanese Shingon lineage, which is an esoteric lineage of Buddhism, also known as a tantric lineage, though not the tantra most people think of when they hear that word. It just means like for a long time and not nearly as sexy as everyone thinks. And I've been with the Academy since like 2018. I found them through other work I was doing and actually hired Consent Academy to teach at my wedding because I'm a big nerd. And then Ash and I became co-directors at the same time back in 2022, 2021. I don't remember which year. Ash, which year was it?
January 2022.
Perfect. And that's it for me. Ash, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my name's Ash. It's short for Asha. Been in the co-director position since 2022. I started volunteering in 2018. How I came to find Consent Academy was I was in a sex educator certification program, and at the same time I was also volunteering with a domestic violence agency doing a support group. And I just saw so many parallels between consent in both of those spaces, being talked about as like a way to increase pleasure and joy in sexual and romantic relationships. And then in the DV support group, so many people recognizing ways in which their consent has been violated throughout their life that kind of primed them to be in an abusive relationship and not recognize it as such. And so I was like, who's teaching about consent as like a way where we can have like really positive relationships and avoid violence? And so I Googled Consent Seattle, and I'm so grateful that Consent Academy came up, kind of just stuck with them ever since. And outside of this, I am an adjunct faculty member at Antioch University for their sex therapy and sex education certificate program. I'm an abortion doula. I'm studying to be a full spectrum doula. Yeah, I have a lot of interests that what consent has kind of like spurred me into different directions.
Awesome. Well, man, there's so many different things that I would love to just pick y'all's brains about. There's so many cool, interesting stuff here, so I'll try to keep focused. So maybe we could talk a little bit about Consent Academy itself and what the work that you all do looks like.
Yeah, I can take that one. So we are a nonprofit international educational collective. We were originally founded in Seattle, Washington in 2016. A group of 10 people came together in a basement and kind of hashed out our four-part model of consent that we still use today. Our mission is to teach about consent and all of its complexity and potential. And we do that using this four-part model and kind of like all of the ways that that encompasses the way we think about consent. We think about consent as something that's present in our everyday life, not just during sex. So education is our main focus. We do free monthly Foundations of Consent workshops. Since the pandemic, we are mostly online for all of our public workshops, but we can be hired to do private workshops in person. And yeah, I'm based in Berkeley, California. Ariana's in Vienna, Austria. So the online piece works out well for us. We do some stuff locally and in person. Yeah, the free monthly workshops, free discussion groups for men, women, trans, non-binary, and genderqueer folks, BIPOC, and then other ad hoc classes. And then our flagship series is the Consent and Leadership series, which is for people in any kind of position of leadership, formal or informal, wanting to gain skills around consent, accountability, and how to create consensual space and culture wherever they're organizing, teaching, etc. We also do consent advocacy services. So people that are directly involved in a consent incident, whether you're the person who has been harmed, who has been accused of harm, or you're responsible for harm. We provide trauma-informed peer support, guidance, and resources on next steps. We also do Q&A sessions, which is essentially consultation for organizations, especially that want to create policies and procedures around what to do with consent incidents. And I think that is it. We also have some on-demand courses as well online. And yeah, let me know if I'm missing anything, Ariana. I think that's everything you do.
I think it's everything that we do. We're always trying to expand the work that we do and to sort of reach out to new people. Hearing it listed out, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I mean, just the consent and leadership courses, like it was so valuable. And each one of them was really something that you could spend a whole year like getting into the nitty-gritty of these issues and exploring it from different like lenses and stuff. And so yeah, I found it so valuable. And yeah, so thank you. Maybe we could talk a little bit about what that four-part model of consent looks like so folks have something to kind of visualize here.
So basically, we have this idea that there's many different types of consent, and we're really looking for valid consent. So consent that's really grounded in everyone authentically showing up to the situation and that it feels good and like in agreement in our bodies. And we like the etymology of the word consent, which means to feel together or with feeling. If we think of con as with and sent like sentiment or sensation, that means feeling. So it's with feeling. So that's sort of the basis that we're thinking of everything with consent from. That consent is more about feelings and sensations rather than rules and logic, but we still have to be able to make sense of it. So we came up with this four-part model of consent to help with that. So we have these different pillars. If we think of it like a building, the foundation of the building would be autonomy, everybody's fundamental right to choose what is best for themselves, including their mind, their body, their spirit, their information and story, things that are an extension of you. And then the first pillar would be capacity. So capacity is your ability to give and receive a clear-headed yes or no to something. Lots of different things affect our capacity. We should think of capacity as existing on a spectrum from incapacitated to 100% capable. That 100% capable is really rare, kind of only exists in video games where it says like you wake up well rested. We're always at usually some part of reduced capacity, whether it's because we're tired or hungry or our blood sugar is low or we have a headache or, we're distracted or something. And so the more our capacity is reduced, the more the risk of consent going wrong goes up. That's the first pillar. The next pillar would be information and understanding. And so information is, like, do I actually know what I'm consenting to? And then understanding is, do I actually understand? And these are actually two really different things. So it's one thing for you to give me all the information about a situation, and it's another thing for me to also then be able to understand that situation. An example of this that's really useful for a lot of people is like when a doctor is explaining to you the potential side effects of a medication. Even if they tell you all those side effects and their relative risks or the likelihood of them happening, that doesn't necessarily mean you really understand what that then is going to mean for you. So many years ago, I took a medication that had the side effect of dry eye. And my doctor said there was a small chance that the dry eye could be permanent. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, like my eyes get dry sometimes. I did not realize that that could mean that like I would need to use eye drops for the rest of my life, like pretty consistently because my eyes get too dry. So there's a big difference in the information and understanding. And then we have agreement and buy-in. So are people actually agreeing to things? And like, do they really actually want to do this thing? And this is not to say that, you know, the only type of valid consent is like enthusiastic, because it's not. There's many things that I fully authentically consent to and I'm not enthusiastic about, like changing my baby's diapers. Like I don't look forward to changing a poopy diaper, but I very, very much consent to doing it because I want to take care of my child.
Mm-hmm.
Or I might consent to going to a movie that like a Marvel movie. I don't love those movies, but I love my friends who love those movies and I like seeing them excited. So I agree to go to the movie. But we think of, you know, the idea that if it's coerced, it's not valid consent. And people really should be agreeing to like, what am I actually saying yes to? In what manner, to what intensity, for how long? And the least risky type of agreement is explicit and verbal. The riskier types are implicit and nonverbal, but they can also still be valid. And then we also think about power. And power is something that affects all of the rest of this. The more power differentials there are between people, the more risk that there is of consent being violated. The more we can do to offset that power differential, the more we can reduce risk, whether that's giving people more time, more information, physically reducing power differentials, things like that. Yeah, is there anything you'd want to add to this really quick summary, Ash?
We can get into so much depth with each of the pillars. I think the only thing I would add is that we kind of tossed about the idea of adding in other pillars, because there's so much that's like relevant to this, but like specifically with autonomy, because that's the foundational piece. It's why we need to practice consent at all. If I want to do something with another autonomous being, I have to create this feeling of consent between us. And so many people come to us with ideas around autonomy that are interesting, where they're like, well, yeah, I like want people to say yes to me. I want to get what I want. And it's like, that's great. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. And how you were talking about the least risky type of agreement. Risk is something that goes throughout all of this. And like on the other hand with risk, to me, is responsibility. As autonomous beings, we only really know what's going on with ourselves. And that's something that can take like a whole lifetime to really truly understand yourself, what it is you want and why it is you behave in certain ways, etc. With other people, we're not expecting you to be a mind reader. All of these pillars of consent that hold up the structure of valid consent, you're trying your best with this process. And we want to normalize that, like, it's pretty normal for consent to like fall down at some points. Really important is how you respond after that. We don't expect you to be mind readers, and we can't teach the right way to practice consent that'll guarantee that you never violate consent ever in your lifetime, because everybody has autonomy. They get to decide how they feel. Your feelings can take a long time to be processed. And if at any point in the future you're like, you know, that didn't actually feel consensual, then that's the reality. And so coming back to autonomy of we're each trying our best. We, of course, want things. We have to negotiate with others and create this feeling of consent. I think having autonomy means you also have responsibility, because you didn't create yourself. Your autonomy didn't come out of nowhere. How you got to this point of having wants and desires and wanting to do things with other people is because somebody has taken care of you your whole life. There's a whole group infrastructure that was created before you were born, why you're able to get food, water, why your waste just magically goes away, healthcare, all of these things. We owe a lot to each other, actually. We have this like built-in responsibility to a community. And so, yeah, toss around the idea of adding in like this little structure of consent exists in a background of interdependence. It's not just autonomous beings that arise out of nowhere. They each come from communities and have responsibilities to them as well. So how you practice consent is going to look different depending on what culture you're in, and trying to navigate other people's culture is a big part of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And at what level you're sort of like looking at, whether it's interpersonally, as you mentioned, Ash, like, or on a more systemic level with organizations and stuff. And so, yeah, it's really complicated and nuanced stuff. But I really love the model that you all have put together to kind of tease this stuff apart. Fuck yeah.
In our basic foundations of consent class, we spend a lot of time on these pillars of like how you practice consent. And then there's also a section where we talk about like how you think about consent, that we often think about it in a very binary way, that it's either present or not present. We focus a lot on the words yes and no, and then this kind of focus on logic and rules rather than feelings and sensations. And that takes up like a good amount of the hour and a half that we have for this class. What I always want to talk about and like touch on a little bit is that consent is something that can come into play when we're interacting with any other being, is the way that I like to phrase it. And of course, we're mainly talking about humans with other humans. But like, even when I just like insert the idea of like, what about animals? What about systems, institutions, or on a more esoteric or spiritual level, like other spirits, other beings, other entities? That to me is always really interesting to think about consent on that level as well. And we don't normally get to do that. So that's part of why I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying, because I was going to say, I hope we can get into a little bit more of, as you said, the esoteric or spiritual side of this stuff, because I think that there's a lot of interesting nuance there that isn't really talked about, but that maybe could be and could be some really interesting ground to get into as we move forward in occultism and elsewhere.
Absolutely. I think I can start with like an example of, if anyone's listening and they're like, okay, but how does like consent apply with non-humans? And maybe some people are like, oh yeah, I totally get this. But an example that I like to give to people when they're kind of like, what does this even mean? Is just thinking about consent with my cats. Lots of people like to joke about how like cats are a great lesson in consent because they're not like dogs. Dogs can be a bit sycophantic, or they're really like eager to please and they just kind of let you do whatever. But cats like clearly have boundaries. And there is the consent of like the cat doesn't want you to pet them, so they swipe at you or they walk away or whatever. But that's not the only way it exists. It doesn't just exist in this negative sense. But let's say, for example, I need to pick my cat up for some reason, right? Like maybe they've got something stuck to their fur and I need to clean it off, or I just want to pick them up. One of my cats actually really likes to be picked up. One doesn't, one really does. And instead of just exerting my will upon that animal, that's often how we interact with our pets. We just kind of exert our desires onto them without necessarily stopping to consider, are they in the mood for this? And is this going to feel good to them? So whenever I go to pick my cats up, I do a little ritual. So I put my right hand behind their front shoulder, and then I put my left hand in front of their back leg, and then I have both hands there. And if the cats don't want to be picked up, they clearly tell me no, they walk away quickly. And because I do this ritual the same way every time, they know what it means. And if they're interested in being picked up, they'll usually stop. And then I put my fingers underneath them and then I lift them up like that. I don't do the thing where a lot of people pick their cats up like they're picking up a baby with like both hands under their front shoulders. That's actually really hard on their shoulders. So this is also part of the consent, is like knowing a lot about the being that I'm interacting with, especially when I have a lot of power over them. So they have these like floating shoulder joints. It's how they're able to like squish through things. So they don't have this nice like architecture that really anchors those shoulders in. So if you pick them up like that, it can be painful for them or can injure them. So I always pick them up in this one way. And then if they change their mind, because I do this lift really slowly, they can just get out of my hands. And so by interacting with them in this really respectful manner, where like, I want them to enjoy the experience as well. Or if it's something where like, I have to pick them up for their own safety, they know what to expect and what's coming. And they have multiple opportunities to say no. And I do it the same way every time to also give them that. So I'm talking very specifically about pets, but you can also kind of see how this might work when it comes to interacting with anything. approaching it with respect, taking your time, signaling what's coming, and trying to do things the same way every time and giving multiple opportunities for no's. And that can really be a great little structure to have, especially if you are interacting with something entirely new as well, taking it nice and slow and, really making sure that you give space for things to change or consent to be revoked. As we mentioned beforehand, there's that part of consent and discovery. And so if you're interacting with another being for the first time, there's a lot of discovery that's going to be happening, and giving it space to be explored gently can make a big difference.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. The cat is actually symbolically one of the things that we've been working with for our Void House project. We have a Void Cat entity, which is a sort of protector and consent forward thing. So I love that you brought cats into the equation here. Thank you.
Nice.
So when we're talking about, and this is one thing that I've always thought could be really interesting to explore about doing like group magical work, because magic is so much about intent and like these symbolic actions and stuff, and what do these mean to us? Conversations really getting into that territory are conversations about consent as well, and like having the tools to really have those types of conversations is something that I'm really excited about.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about the idea of the magical will, or the idea of intention, and how it relates to consent?
So there's so much that can be said about this, and there's so many ways we can talk about magic when it comes to autonomy and consent, and so many just different forms of like honestly mundane everyday magic that we don't even recognize are there. The way I think about a lot of magic and a lot of sort of like power that we have in shaping reality is like fireworks going off in the daytime, like a little far away from you, which is like they're spectacular, they're gorgeous, they're beautiful, and you might not even notice that it's there. But that doesn't make it any less real or powerful, even though you're not paying attention to it, or it's sort of somehow just blends into the background. Before we got on the call, Ash and I were talking about Alan Moore a little bit, and his perspective on how like language is magic. That is absolutely one of the reasons why I was interested in linguistics and also psychology. To me, psychology feels a lot like magic, and this idea of essentially, as a psychologist, if you're like a clinical psychologist or a therapist, if your client or your patient basically thinks the right series of thoughts and says the right series of words, they're cured. I mean, that's a really like gross oversimplification, but like, it's essentially like a spell. Like if you can just get the spell into their mind to reshape their entire perception of reality, or not necessarily entire, but some part of their perception of reality and of themselves, you can change the future of their life. You can change their trajectory. You can change their experience of things. Like, how is that not magic? So when it comes to will, for me, I always have thought of like will as one of the earliest magics that we have, which is that like I can have a thought, a desire, an instinct, something inside of me, and then use that to shape my surroundings. If you ever have a child, it's really great because you get to just like watch this process of the formation of will as they sort of develop from being like a newborn into a child. Like watching, I have a baby that will be 9 months old tomorrow, and watching him go from having just like sensations and reactions to sensations and like obviously desire, right? Like the first thing a baby does when it's born is basically scream for milk and like have this desire. And this is actually a big thing in my lineage of Buddhism, because if anyone knows about Buddhism, like there's this general idea of like desires being one of the root causes of suffering. But in my lineage of Buddhism, which is a bit unique, desire is not all seen as bad. The only desires that are seen as bad are the ones that like cause attachments and then cause suffering. And like desires, especially that we share in common with animals and things that are instinctual or things that don't cause us harm or cause others harm, are considered to be really important. And we even have like a fire ritual that we do. That's like a wish fulfillment ritual where you like write your desires on these wooden pieces of paper. And then the monk who's doing the ritual sort of like burns them in this fire in front of our fire deities. And so like desire is seen as like actually really important in my lineage of Buddhism, but it's always in conjunction with everybody else's desires. So like the limits of what I can affect or what I should affect without necessarily something bad happening or coming back to me, whether we want to call it karma or the threefold law or the law of three. And I think there's some other traditions that use a different number than three, is where we get into those boundaries with other people. And, you know, when our boundaries, when our sort of will and autonomy overlaps with each other, that's when we need to negotiate a lot and really sort of come into these spaces of consent. Yeah, anyway, I could go on and on also about babies and their development, but I'm going to pass it over to Ash for a minute.
Foxtrot, 3, Romeo, 2, 4, Yankee, Romeo, 7, Bravo, Delta, Quebec.
Greetings, it is I, Luxa from the future. We'll be getting back to the rest of my chat with Ash and Ariana in just a little while here. After the interview, we're going to be getting into some fun listener mail and shoutouts. But now, let me give you a quick update about what we have going on with the Green Mushroom Project and Void House. Green Mushroom Project is an ongoing group magical working I designed and some friends and I started back in 2020 with the following 4 objectives: to create a network of green or Venus aspected magic for practitioners to draw upon for creative healing and restorative works. The word hypho means web, and the sigil we're using was inspired by the linking sigil created by the DKMU. Has its own sort of type of linking properties, webbing, if you will. Second objective was to build and strengthen community and empower individuals within it. Third, to strengthen our position against hate groups and other bullshit through solidarity. And the fourth, to encourage individuals to use powerful tech to become more agentic. Working with the biological metaphor of the ecological relationship some fungi share with some plants, if we, the magical practitioners of the Green Mushroom Project, are like a forest of trees, the Green Mushroom current connects us and strengthens us in unseen ways. In addition to the mycelial web, which connects us, there is also the mushroom's spores, which are tiny little packets of the current's energy, which can be applied to situations as needed by any participant. You can think of them as micro-servitors if you want to. If that word servitor is confusing, I suggest you check out the first or few episodes of this show entitled Explaining Chaos Magic to My Brother. There's some good chaos magic basics in there. We are also putting together some chaos magic basics classes that we're going to be offering on the Green Machine server, where the Green Mushroom Project has its home. Our newest experiment, Void House, is about organizing a consent-forward magical space in which to conduct group work, both in person and online, as well as investigating the healing and alchemical properties of consent. A big part of this is going to be education. We had a meeting in Portland earlier this summer, which went really, really well. I'm looking forward to more opportunities to be hanging out here soon. We're planning some pretty fucking cool stuff. And several of us are in the performing arts and like the idea of like performing publicly as well. So perhaps there will be some of that coming down the line as well. We'll be celebrating the 4th anniversary of the Green Mushroom Hypho Sigil Project's founding this Halloween or around then. The mushroom is turning 4, and we're going to be doing a Pirates Revel, which is a pirate-themed ritual party, or perhaps party ritual, which is going to be part of that. We had a ritual planning workshop the other night in which some really cool ideas for a healing-style Pirates Revel were put forth, and I'm really stoked about it. Got a lot of fun, free activities planned on the Green Machine server. Join us for our weekly Fungal Friday chats about a variety of magical topics, as well as special events like seasonal ceremonies and celebrations. There is a monthly rune study group as well as a book club in which Aidan Wachter's 6 Ways is being languorously discussed and digested. The Green Machine Discord is also a good place to come and ask questions about magic or esoterica or to pose philosophical inquiries. We have a lot of people who are into sharing about what's worked and what hasn't worked for them in their practices and getting into like esoterica and stuff. There's a lot of really fucking smart people there. I'm continuously impressed and humbled by many of the cool things that I see there. In addition to learning about magic and occultism, we are offering some stuff about consent, as you have heard. Very proud to announce that we're going to be hosting a free 2-part workshop about consent, group work, and magic, which has been created especially for Void House by the Consent Academy, and which will take place September 14th and 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern on the Green Machine Discord server. I think the actual thing is going to be on Zoom, but Discord is where we are organizing everything. Email or reach out to me on Instagram for a link to that Discord if you are interested in attending. There's a Foundations of Consent workshop that Consent Academy offers for free each month, and for $15 to take at your own pace, which is a sort of prerequisite for this special, more specific workshop that we're offering for the magically inclined through Void House. I'm also going to be hosting a special chat on Friday the 13th of September, starting at 9 p.m. Eastern, as a lead into the workshop called Sexy Spooky Consent Chat. It should be a lot of fun, so come check it out. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or get me on Instagram at luxoccultpod and get a link to that server. The idea of consent being a central guiding philosophical principle to magical group work, as well as providing education about the nuances of consent to magically inclined people, is something I'm very interested in, and I feel incredibly proud and grateful to have the opportunity to be pursuing this work. Thank you so much to everybody who has been assisting with our efforts and who has been showing so much enthusiasm for doing things this way. Fuck yeah, gratitude. Okay, as I said, I will be back after the interview to share some listener mail as well as a few final thoughts. But now, let's get back into the rest of my conversation with Ash and Ariana from the Consent Academy. Leading into that, I'm going to play a sound sigil track which contains audio recorded during the recent Portland, Oregon gathering of Void House. This track is called Void Cat Cometh, Iteration 2.
Yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, yeah, cho, cha, yeah, raw, raw, yep, 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 yeah, cho, cha, yeah, raw, raw,
Man
yep,
getting bit by an alligator in
cho,
screams.
cha, yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, cho, cha, yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, cho, cha, yeah, raw, raw, yep,
Man getting bit by an alligator in screams.
yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, cho, cha, 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 yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, cho, cha,
Man getting
yeah,
bit by
raw,
an
raw,
alligator in
yep,
screams.
yeah, cho, cha, yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, cho, cha, yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, cho, cha, yeah, raw, raw, yep, yeah, cho, cha, raw, raw, yep.
So we were talking about this a little bit before we got on. Arya was explaining this idea of thinking of our will and our sense of autonomy as one of the earliest kinds of magic. And I was wrapping my head around that. Yeah, I have this perspective of animism that everything has spirit and has autonomy in some way. And like our perception of ourself as a self is also like a type of magic that's occurring, an illusion, because really we're just like a combination of a bunch of things, of like bacteria and viruses and fungus and all these cells that are communicating and then also acting autonomously themselves. We have an autonomic nervous system that has autonomy and is just making things happen for us magically, like breathing and blinking and pumping blood. And I'm so glad that I don't have to think about doing that, because that would just be so much work. Yeah, so like there's all these beings at all times with their own motivations and intentions shaping the world, whether we're noticing it or not. I actually really like that analogy of fireworks in the daytime. Yeah, all of this stuff is happening beneath the surface and like between groups of people, between cultures. There's the idea of like egregores, which is kind of like this idea of like a collective thought belief from people that like creates a real being that we interact with. And like I would argue that like we're doing that kind of thing all the time. Even like our like modern conception of consent can kind of become this own being that we have to interact with and has its own like intentions. And sometimes I get scared. I'm like, what kind of monster is this thing becoming? Like it gets a little out of hand sometimes because we're doing all of this without really focused intention of like what we're creating and yeah, devoting energy to and what it might become. So yeah, I think of it like Alan Moore talking about how language is magic. Our intentions, our thoughts and ideas, desires come together in us and like have an energy. And when you're a kid, you're really just like stoked by this and are like, wow, I can shape the world. And then we want to do it to other people. We want to create other things with other people. And a big part of growing up is learning that everybody else has all of this intention and their own ideas and wants and desires. You have to negotiate with them. Mm-hmm. And I think like spiritual development is about recognizing that everything in the universe also has this set of intentions and ideas and beliefs and wants, and you also have to negotiate with them. And so like, how are you doing that? How are you directing energy to that? And if you aren't, then that kind of neglectful energy can still have impacts. It can still create things that you then have to negotiate with as well. Yeah. So that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate that. Yeah, there's so much there to explore. I love that you brought up egregores. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of like how this looks and how they arise organically, as you said sometimes. And yeah, lots of crazy stuff there for sure. The idea of power over versus power with was something that came up in, I think it was the consent and leadership classes. And like, I've been thinking about this from a sort of like esoteric perspective as well. And thinking about like when we have power with others, that's a sort of like additive thing. Like everybody's adding to that equation and the wheel is spinning faster or whatever, like, metaphor we want to think about as like the output of this power, right? Like, when we have power over others, like there's a lot of like friction in this like interaction. Like there's things that are going against other things that are not like in alignment. And I don't think it's additive anymore in that same like way. So just from that sort of like perspective of like how things work in that esoteric level, can sense like a really attractive thing to me as well, just from that pragmatic standpoint.
Yeah, I think of consent as like a weaving together of different things. What you described of like that friction, I try to avoid talking about consent in binary ways, but it is helpful to think about what the opposite of consent would be. And that's dissent, which has the roots in Latin meaning to feel against. And it's exactly that feeling of friction. I also think of it as like a record scratch where it's like, and like we can feel that, or even if we aren't tuned in to feeling into that, it has impacts. With every action, there's a reaction. So the process of consent, like interpersonally and on like spiritual levels, to me is like trying to smoothen things out as much as possible, avoid that friction. Like it's normal for different autonomous beings to have different feelings and desires and for them to not align perfectly in any given moment. But like the magic of consent is like we can still smooth that out and weave these things together. It takes a lot of skill, it takes a lot of practice. It especially takes slowing down and kind of feeling into what I think of as like a third space, like a liminal space between people that is on more of an energetic level. Like when I'm in academic classes, I'm like, you know, the vibes because we have like that word for it. But I really do think of it as like a spiritual space. And we don't necessarily always talk about that in our day to day, but I don't think that that makes it any less real. It definitely has impacts.
Yeah, I really also appreciate the perspective of like understanding that like mistakes are going to happen, right? And like that's just part of life, and like being comfortable with like knowing that you are going to fuck up, and like, okay, when I fuck up, like how will I try to do better, right? Like just kind of getting I think that gives people a lot of permission to approach the subject that they felt maybe was a little bit too daunting because of that like fear of whatever like, you know, might have happened or whatever, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Messing up with consent is like a part of the process of learning about consent. It's absolutely guaranteed to happen. And what really matters most is how you respond. Do you keep trying to practice consent even in that moment of learning what you've done? Yeah, like keep trying to weave together. Now you have this impact you have to deal with and all of the things that come with that. There's consequences. How you move through that can be in a consensual manner or a really non-consensual manner. And again, coming back to that binary bias that we have, people often think, well, now I've messed up, I'm a bad person. And then that is a spell that's setting them off in that direction to act in that way, in alignment with that, rather than people mess up. This is a part of learning about consent and a part of being a human and interacting with other humans. Now I have more challenges, but I can still practice consent in dealing with this harm. And that's like a different spell that could send you off in a different direction. And that's kind of like the spell we're trying to cast at large with Consent Academy. Of a consent culture isn't one in which nobody ever gets their consent violated. It's one in which when consent is violated, people move in accountable ways. And the community holds them to that and expects that of them. And it actually makes you have like a lot of a less fear of violating consent. And you can take different types of risks in a community like that. Yeah, really hoping to create that maybe in our lifetime, hopefully.
Yeah, right. And I think that consent can also be a sort of spell of protection as well, because it offers the tools, like understanding it can help you mitigate some of the risk of, you know, having consent incidents and stuff occur if you really understand like where you sit, like what with your power dynamics in the situation and other things like that. Having that awareness can really give a person a lot of protection from accidentally getting into territory that they didn't even understand that they were getting into with somebody else in terms of consent and stuff too. So I think, and so it protects, it can be a spell of protection for everybody at the table too.
I like that. I mean, we talk a lot about teaching children, and I love seeing Ariana being a parent and practicing consent with her kid and how awesome he's going to grow up to be because he's had that. Yeah, that like, I just think about my own life. If I had had any kind of consent education at a younger age or in my family, at my school, and my just like general community, how much harm could have been avoided or that I would have known was harm and not normal. Yeah, I really resonate with that.
Yeah.
There was something that kind of came up earlier that we touched on just a little bit, but this idea of like, you know, sometimes you have to take time to process how you actually feel about something. And this is also a thing that I think is a skill that has to develop. Like I watch my baby learning how to process his feelings and how to process his desires, right? We practice it a lot by just like offering him like 2 toys to play with. And I get to sit there and like watch him pick which one he wants to play with. And then sometimes he changes his mind, but most of the time he's like really satisfied with the one he picked and he just plays with it. It's a really simple example. But there's always this question people get worried about like, oh, what if someone realizes down the line that they weren't really consenting to something, or what if someone wants to withdraw their consent after the fact, or how do we know what we really want? And I think that's one of the questions that's sort of hidden under a lot of these discussions is like, how do I actually know if I'm truly consenting to something? How do I actually know if I really want something? And in some ways, I think that we'll never truly know, right? Because we're never just one thing, right? You know, in the very basic sense, you know, we're a lot of cells and we have all of this, you know, microbiome that exists inside and around us. And we have this like invisible cloud around us of like bits of our own cells and like all these things that have come from us, the germs and everything. But we're also not just our own experience of things. And this is another place where I think like there is the influence of, I know this is a very roundabout way to talk about this, but there's the influence of other things that have power over us and interaction with our own will. And the way that I like to think of it almost as like gravity, as like there can be like a local extreme gravity well that like pulls you into something that you might not otherwise actually want. And like the more something is wanted in society, the more power that thing has. And this will all make sense in a second when I give you an example. The Mona Lisa, the painting, it's like a lot of people, when you ask them to think of like fine art, that is what comes to mind, or one of the paintings that comes to mind. It's often used as like this image to be like, this represents like the peak of art. Well, the thing is like, it's actually not that great of a painting. And it was not famous for most of its history. It got famous. Most people think it's famous because it's just like so great and so beautiful. But it got famous because it was the first painting, and I think not the only, but one of the only paintings to ever be stolen from the Louvre in France. And they didn't even realize it was stolen for like years. It was just like rotting in some storage area, and someone just walked in and stole it. And then like when they realized it was missing, suddenly all this attention was turned onto it, and it became like people were like, oh, why was this painting stolen? Oh, and then there was like this big international sort of hunt for it. And when it was finally returned, Jackie Kennedy went and saw it. She was like, had studied at the Sorbonne, and like she had this like link with France, and she was seen as so classy. And then because she went and saw it, it like also was then really legitimized. And now because so many people want to see it, and it's because it's behind this like special plexiglass and you can't get that close to it. And like, if you ever go to the Louvre, it's like the room is always full of people there to see the Mona Lisa. It's hard to go to the Louvre and like not feel yourself pulled towards that. Oh, I'm here. I might as well just see it. Right? Like, oh, I can't come all this way and like not see it, is what I hear a lot of people say about it when they're like, oh, I went to France and like, I had to see the Mona Lisa. And I always want to ask them why. Why did you need to see that painting? Why is that what you wanted? And this is one of those things where I think it still comes back kind of to magic, which is that the like power we have given this painting through so many people going and essentially worshiping it, right? If we think of how we spend our time, any time that we spend as like an act of worship, like I'm literally cutting off a length of my life to put onto the altar of the Mona Lisa by going to go see it. The more something is sort of worshipped, the more powerful it becomes, the more influence that it has. And I think this is also a really good way to think about understanding, why do I actually want the things that I want? And how do I know that I want them? And do I want to decide to not engage with those wants, even though I really, really want them? Or do I want to just say, whatever, it's, you know, I want the selfie next to the Mona Lisa and that'll be cool. And like, you know,
Yeah. I'm
okay,
thinking about the devil card from the tarot here that kind of comes up with these questions, right? Like, well, do we want to stay in these chains and have fun, or are we going to move on? Or what? I don't know.
Yeah, it was kind of a roundabout thing, but it's a thing I think about a lot, especially when it comes to like internal consent and like meaning consent like with ourselves. And, you know, do I actually know that I want this thing? Do I actually know what it's going to mean for me to get this thing that I want, or to have some sort of power, or to be in some sort of position of authority, or whatever it is that we're looking for? And do I know where this desire came from? We can also talk about like intergenerational magic, or, some people might call it trauma or healing.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
but, desires can be like put into us as well by other people.
Mm.
And yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Edward Bernays and propaganda and the whole engineering consent idea and like, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Kind of bringing it down to ground for folks listening in terms of like exploring this internal, like where are these boundaries of consent within the self? What are some practices that people might find helpful in terms of like interrogating those questions for themselves, do you think?
The thing I'll just say simple with, sort of exploring internal consent is we have an article on our Patreon about this topic, let me see if I can remember the title of it. Can you violate your own consent? We had that. And what to do if you aren't sure your consent has been violated. Those two articles I kind of wrote together, and they sort of talk about this particular topic and how to sort of explore this. What does it mean to violate your own consent, and what to do if you're not sure if you've violated or if your consent's been violated. And they have a lot of, especially the second one has a lot of questions to sort of ask. It's very much more after the fact, but things like checking in with your body, exploring impact that you're experiencing, reflecting on your own behavior, things like that it sort of pulls together.
Awesome. Yeah, right on.
Yeah, I would add thinking about consent as a shared feeling. Emotional intelligence is key to all of this. But in my opinion, emotions, we notice them first as like sensations in our body. And we've been like under a cultural spell for a long time that says, just pay attention to what's going on above the shoulders, what you can see, what you can smell, especially the words that people are saying and you're hearing, and the thoughts that you're having. A lot of us are really trapped in our head in that way. And so feeling into the rest of your body and recognizing that it has valuable information for you, that there are parts of you that are trying to speak to you. And we have like language for this, your gut feeling, like quite literally feel into your gut and what you're feeling there. And I think we are also in a really erotophobic society that doesn't want to think about eroticism because it's associated with sex. And we have this puritanical idea of like sex is sinful. Even if you personally don't believe in this, like the culture is moving this way. And so it impacts all of us as like, what are those egregores?
Sure. Thing that has to be purchased. And if you find it in the wild, it's gross or something. Or like, yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so like, I think cultures before really had this idea that your gut feeling is like all the guts, the dirtiness of your guts. And so that's like your stomach, your intestines, but also like your uterus, your colon, your genitals, like your root, all of that. What is it feeling? And so many of us like can't feel anything actually. When I've asked people to do this, they're like, I don't feel anything. And that's like that disconnection as a part of that cultural spell that says just ignore it. And I think it's also reinforced by like things we do, like sitting in chairs and wearing tight pants.
Yeah.
Just like those practical things too.
Absolutely. There's places too where, I've seen there's medications that you can take where it's like, oh, do you like feel sick after you eat all this like crazy junk food and gorge yourself? Like you can take this pill after and you'll be fine. It's like, well, maybe you should be more respectful of your body and you won't feel sick because you ate the bunch of food that made you feel sick. Or I mean, like, but just that sort of like, oh, don't worry about it. Take this pill, like, I don't know. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. So I think that that's a lot of where the feeling into work needs to happen of like, and it's such like a funny thing to me, but I will literally say to like my partner is like, breathe into your ass. Can you even like tell how clenched your butthole is right now? Because I can feel it from here.
Breathe into your ass is going to be my new mantra. I love this. Thank you.
Yeah, like when I use tarot cards, that's like what I'm physically doing is like breathing into my ass and like relaxing and like that's kind of like where I feel like those smartest ideas come from, which feels like so opposite to what we've been taught is like, inspiration from the divine, like hits your crown or whatever. I'm like, no, from the ground up. Like that's where I start, like with my feet, with my legs, with my butt. And then I'm like, okay, now I can like be open to actually feeling what direction I need to go into, what card I need to pull.
Yeah, and some traditions even talk about this connection between like the crown and the root or whatever. This comes up in a lot of different contexts. And so I love this. Thank you. Well, I'm looking at the time here. Is there anything that I didn't ask about that you all would like to mention, or do you have any questions that you would like to ask me?
I mean, I feel like we could keep going. There's a lot of things I feel like we could still talk about, just a lot. Because I also just think that there's so many practices that also can be helpful for when, like consent is hard to understand or where you're not sure how to go forward with things. And the same is true with anything esoteric as well, which is just like people often have this binary thinking of like, you have to have perfect understanding of it in order to benefit from it. And I just want to say that with consent and with a lot of spiritual practices, you come through understanding often through practice. It doesn't have to be this mind versus emotion versus practice. You can just come to an understanding after the fact, and it's okay. Is there anything else you want to add, Ash?
I would want to ask you, Luxa, something I ask a lot of people from different communities is like, what do you wish that your community, however you define that, which I'm also curious about, what do you wish that your community knew about consent? Like, what's the biggest kind of consent issue in your idea in the occult space?
I think that I would say that I am hoping that people will be able to contextualize it as something that applies in much the same way as Consent Academy talks about it to situations that are not necessarily like sexual or medical or whatever, but it really is something that can exist as more of, how are we interacting with each other as people and our understanding of like what we're hoping and intending in the world and really coming to that respect for each other, I think. I think that just kind of giving people permission to like explore that in new contexts and think about that in their lives in ways that can help them build autonomy in other, like areas of life as well. I think there's some places in some people's like work situations where there's a lot of pressure. There's all kinds of places where we could talk about consent in the world and different communities. And so like the idea of giving people these like tools to contextualize it and deconstruct it maybe and then apply it in different ways is something that's interesting to me. Like my community is sort of focused around like chaos magic because it can be this really like kind of big tent way of allowing in a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different traditions, because it tends to look at things in a sort of like deconstructed way that like allows for all these different perspectives to like all be true at once. And so in much the same way that like chaos magic can offer those types of tools, I think that learning about consent can do that in other ways. And so bringing those things together is something that I'm really excited about. And I'm really excited about the special workshops that we'll be doing with Consent Academy and Void House on the 14th and the 15th of September coming up here. So anybody who's hearing this and is interested in coming and exploring these, intersections of magic and consent, please let me know, and I will give you a link to the server and we can get you all set up. But thank you so much for joining me here. Is there any last words or thoughts that either of you or both of you would like to offer to the listeners? And also, where can people find Consent Academy and how can they get involved if they would like to?
Yeah, you can find us. Our website is just www.consent.academy. We have a mailing list that we recommend people sign up for if you want to find out about the things that are coming up at the Consent Academy. Like we have, starting at the end of September on the 21st, our Consent and Leadership series is happening again. This time it'll be on Saturdays. And we have a lot of other really good classes coming up. We have a Patreon. And if you join our Patreon, even at the lowest tier, you get access to our Discord server, where you can join us for things like watch parties and resource sharing and discussions of all kinds of different aspects of consent with a It's almost like 200 people on there, I think.
I'm there. Yes.
Yeah. And we have a lot of resources on our YouTube and our Twitch. Twitch is currently on hiatus right now because I was the person doing most of the streaming, and with my baby being at home with me, it's a little hard to have the uninterrupted
Content creation is a lot of work, dude. Yeah, I totally get
it
it.
is.
Yeah.
Especially live content creation is
I can only
its
imagine.
own sort of beast. So I'm able to do the stuff that doesn't require live during the day. In the evenings like this, my partner's home and can have the baby. So anyway, we have lots of resources on our Twitch and our YouTube and our Patreon. We publish articles fairly regularly covering all different aspects of consent and lots of different topics. And did I miss anything, Ash?
Yeah, with our upcoming leadership series, it is on Saturdays, but it's also recorded. If you can't or don't want to make it live, a lot of our classes are recorded. We try to be as accessible to people as we can. If finances are a barrier, we often have discounted tickets and scholarships and things available. So please reach out. And if you want consent education, we really want to make it accessible for you. Our kind of motto is consent is essential, consent is for everyone. So I just want to reiterate that this is something that anybody can learn about it. It's not an elitist idea that like wherever you are in life, I think learning about consent can be like really immediately materially helpful for you. And then also give you like hope as well for the world, which I think is really important. And so, Luxa, what you were talking about with what you want to do with your community, I'm like, yes, you are totally in line with our mission and our motto. And like, I want to empower other people to do that as well. If you see a space for consent education in your community and a way that it could improve things, we want to support you in making that possible. So we do accept volunteers who teach the foundations of consent in their own community and put their own twist on it that makes it relevant so that it can speak to those people in the way that it needs to. If that's something that you're interested in, check out our website. We have an application to volunteer.
Oh, yeah. Okay, very cool. Thank you so much. All right, any parting words for the listeners? And I
hope you enjoyed our chat.
Yeah, and feel free to be in touch, ask us questions. Yeah, you can find us on social media at Consent Academy or send us an email, theconsentacademy@gmail.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Real green, green, real green, green.
All right, thanks again so much to Ash and Ariana for joining me. Check out the show notes to find a link to Consent Academy and check out all of their awesome classes and other offerings. I appreciate so much of what was said today and so much of what we talked about. Studying consent, especially this summer with Consent Academy's consent and leadership classes, has been an incredibly healing experience. It's also helped to reinstill some hope and faith in humanity that I think I had lost and was kind of sorely missing. I also really appreciate the outlook that Consent Academy has about no matter how hard you try, there are going to be mistakes and you will end up, violating somebody's consent or causing some type of harm in some other way because communication is difficult or, lots of other reasons. We live in a messy and complicated world and everybody's going to make mistakes. Sometimes you need to make mistakes in order to learn things and it can be a good thing. And we need to accept that and be okay with it. You're not perfect, nobody is, and you will fuck up. And what really counts is how you deal with things after the fact. Consent Academy offers a class about accountability and how to make a good apology, which is really cool. One of the many awesome classes and other resources that they have, so check that out. The idea of consent being this sort of liminal space that can exist between parties, which I think Ash mentioned, makes a lot of sense as well. And it really hits home on a sort of aesthetic level for me about why Void House has the name that it has been given. Gratitude, Void. If you like the show and you like what we've got going on here, you can support it on Patreon, which will entitle you to receive a bibliomancy reading from me. Making the show is, of course, a pretty wild amount of work, especially for just one intrepid podcaster. but it means a lot to me to be able to be doing it. Thank you so much to the people who are making this show possible by giving on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, and to the people who are supporting the show and spreading the word by telling friends, allies, and magical associates about it, as well as everybody you meet on the street or at the hair salon. You can also post about it on social media or write a positive review where that's possible. Both of these things are super helpful, so thank you to everybody who is already doing that. And yes, don't forget to smash the fucking shit out of that follow button so you can get updates when new episodes come out. Don't forget to check out all the awesome shows on the Green Mushroom Podcast Network. We've got Ad Hoc History, Unearthing Paranormalcy, XV Planus, Grognostics, Primordia, and Smuts Up, and of course Lux Occult. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. Alright, let's do listener mail and shoutouts. Shout out and thank you to the Tomo Bedlam. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me about that song for my vocal lessons that I've been having some trouble figuring out how to connect with. The advice you gave me about finding a narrative and a somatic location for that narrative has been super helpful, and yes, finding a lot of progress with it. Definitely going to try a Chapel Roan song next, which should be a lot more my speed, I think. Shout out and thank you so much also to Aaron. I appreciate the generosity. I will be reinvesting this in our Void House educational efforts. Fuck yeah. Shout out to Stacy. Super stoked to hear that you are going to be setting out on your witchcraft journey. May the road rise to meet you, and best of luck. Shout out and much love to all the Pocket Wizards. Really fucking honored to be part of such a rad community. Always impressed by the talent and just breadth of knowledge and thoughtfulness and just overall coolness of the people who hang out there. I'm really, really stoked and fucking proud that we're doing the work that we're doing right now with Void House, exploring consent and how much that will improve things. I'm really excited about some of the magical operations that we have planned, and it's always so fun and cool to see what these just really smart, creative people have going on in their lives. So fuck yeah. Thank you for sharing a little corner of that with me. I appreciate it. Much love and much love to everybody participating in the Green Mushroom Project, regardless of what that looks like for you in your practice. Everyone tapping into that web. Want to remind people that I'm going to be running a book club every third Wednesday, starting on the 18th of September at 6 p.m. Eastern. I'm calling it Subversive Book Club. We're going to be starting with the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. We're going to do the Eye in the Pyramid for the first session, and going on to the Golden Apple for the next one. After we finish Illuminatus trilogy, we're going to be doing Gate to Women's Country by Sherry S. Tepper, which is a pretty wild story that I'm having a hard time unpacking, so hopefully you all can help me out with that. As I said, on the 14th and 15th of September, Void House is going to be hosting a free 2-part consent workshop about group magic and consent, presented by the Consent Academy. So come and check this out. Everybody is welcome. There's also going to be a special Fungal Friday chat on Friday the 13th called Sexy Spooky Consent Chat, which I am hosting, which is going to be like a fun way to get us all warmed up for this deep dive into consent and to get people caught up to speed about, I don't know, maybe vocabulary or whatever other things there might be questions about. Check out the show notes for a link to get tickets to Kink School, the online BDSM education convention, where me and my friend Damien Agony will be teaching a class about sigils and sex magic this November the 23rd. Shout out also to Revelor Press. Super honored to have my work included in Serpents of Circe, a manual to magical resilience, edited by Laura Tempest Zarkov and Ron Pedron. Check out the show notes for a link to order that. Alright, I want to revisit something that Ariana mentioned during the interview about psychology and the idea that there can be a sort of set of words or ideas or concepts that once a person possesses or internalizes them, they are kind of cured or healed or whatever, a spell of healing. I think that the negative messages that float around in our heads might be sort of like the opposite. malefic spells of hurting, perhaps, I don't know. These are things that have been maybe cast on us in the course of just going around in the world, or things that like we pick up from maybe advertising campaigns that tell us that we're ugly and need to buy this product to make ourselves pretty, or whatever it is. You know, things that we can just kind of accrue, like the common cold or whatever. In therapy, we sometimes work directly to figure out what these things are and to try to like get in the habit of challenging them in our minds when they come up. When Ariana mentioned that idea of a healing spell, I began to wonder, like, what would that sound like? What messages would it contain for me? I thought that was a kind of interesting thing to start to interrogate. So I invite you all to do so as well. If there was a sort of healing spell, that if there was a certain set of words or images or understanding that you could sort of internalize, what would that look like for you? I'm going to now read you the Green Mushroom Project Statement of Resistance, and I'm thinking about how these words first came to me and how they appeared and the rest of it, and I'm wondering if that might be in part some of what that looks like for me. Resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of self. Resist by maintaining love of self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah. Thank you so much to Ariana and Ash for joining me. I appreciate so much the work that you all are doing and all of your insights and thoughtfulness. I hope to have one or both of you back soon to continue our discussions and to get into some of this more nuanced territory. We'll see how it goes, hopefully, crossing my fingers. Definitely check out the Consent Academy and all of the awesome classes that they offer. There's some really cool resources, which I think can really be game changers for a lot of people, so fuck yeah. Thanks so much for all of the help and support. Really appreciate all the kind words and other outreachings that I've been getting from people. It really means a lot. Thank you. Also from the support from my unseen allies. Gratitude. Team Unseen. Fuck yeah. Most of all, thanks so much to you for listening. Much love. This is Lux Estrada, reminding you to stay strong and stay fucking curious. Here's Eyes of Your Eyes, produced by me and featuring Flood from XP Planets podcast.
There's something very, very strange. Get the headset on, see if it gets any stronger. Okay, but give us some right out. Notation this is on a battery. It's on a battery? Okay. Still has been removed. Okay. This is falling off again. Yeah. Strange. Right on the horizon.
Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
Epic history.
The Greeks are like on the beach, they're like doing burpees or something. The Persians sail up, and they've got like little spears and pomegranates and stuff, and they're like, hey, wanna be part of our cool empire?
In-depth commentary.
Cutting-edge expert drunken analysis. Two people that you don't know anything about.
It's ad hoc history with Asher and Luxa, siblings extraordinaire.
Hey, just real quick, like, if you were emperor, would you choose me as second emperor?
Next question.
Learning.
It's not pretty. It's not nice. And if you want to talk about justification for war and all these things, but when you get to how the sausage is actually made, this is it.
It's ad hoc history.
It's not the history podcast you wanted. It's the history podcast you deserve.
Welcome to XV Planet. Greetings, friends, fiends, and lovers of strange and wondrous things. My name is Flood, and I am the host of XV Planets, a bi-weekly podcast of the odd and unusual. The core of XV Planets is a documentary-style exploration into paranormal investigations that I and my ever-evolving group of magical misfits conduct. We take a look at the history, the mystery, then go see it for ourselves, and then we bring that experience, and on occasion, that evidence, to your ears. Alongside the investigations, you'll find a treasure trove of other content, like interviews with authors, art historians, mediums, UFO researchers, cryptid hunters, fellow paranormal investigators, as well as deep dives into the arts, exploring topics like the Killing Joke frontman Jazz Coleman's magical practices and how that propelled the band forward, and whether or not David Lynch was really conducting occult rituals through Twin Peaks: The Return. So follow XV Planets today and get caught up on the journey, because I can promise you, it only gets stranger from here. I'll see you on the fifth plane.
Hey, what's up? I'm Luxa.
And I'm Josh. Are you looking for a chill place to hang out online and chat about chaos magic, occultism, witchcraft, and more? Are you hoping to learn and share your knowledge and experience in a place that is welcoming to folks of all different backgrounds and identities?
If so, check out the Green Machine Discord server, home of the Green Mushroom Project. Our growing community of chaotes, occultists, sorcerers, witches, and weirdos has all kinds of fun and interesting things going on. From chats and rituals to workshops, clubs, and more. There's a lot of cool opportunities to get involved.
Sounds great, Luxa. How can folks find us?
Well, for now, we're keeping things pretty small as we grow, so we're not advertising on any of the Discord services that do that. But folks can hit me up and I will send them a link. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at luxoccultpod.
Fuck yeah!
Fuck yeah.